Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this Lifelink Workwell webinar, Embracing Neurodiversity in the Workplace, How to Understand and Support Every Neurotype. Firstly, thanks to our panelists for joining us today, taking some time out of your day to talk to us, share your experiences on neurodiversity. I can see that our panelists are with us now, so we'll just go through some introductions for them while we're waiting for people to continue to join us. First off, we have Sam. She's our clinical manager at Lifelink. We have Barbara, our workplace needs assessor at Lifelink Workwell, and Declan, the executive director of the Centre for Autism Research and Education at Strathclyde University. Just a little bit of housekeeping for our audience. We are in listen-only mode, so if you have any thoughts, questions, things you want to share with us, just use the little text box down at the bottom. We'll pick these up towards the end. I'm going to hand over to the members of our panel for a short introduction. If you could just take a minute or less, guys, introduce yourself, a little bit of background, your current role, your previous experience in the field of neurodiversity. So Sam, if we could start with you, please.
Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, so I'm Sam. I'm the clinical manager for Lifelink Workwell. I'm a CBT therapist and I've been here for 4 years. My background includes working with individuals affected by problematic substance misuse, as well as those at risk of custody or in custody. I'm a clinical supervisor and support kind of work-based relationships as well. And I'm particularly interested in neurodiversity and creating trauma-informed spaces in both therapy and wider systems.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Sam. Barbara, do you want to just take a wee minute to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. My name is Barbara Borthwick and I'm a workplace needs assessor at Lifelink Workwell. I've worked for here just over a year now. My past experience, I have 20 plus, and that's as far as I'm going to go with that, years in assessing sort of learning and development, doing a lot of work around about apprenticeships. I've been 12 years now as a workplace needs assessor, sort of supporting employees who presented with additional support needs, as well as working with apprentices in the work field as well. I'm also an awareness presenter across a variety of subjects. I would say my areas of expertise, and I'll say that loosely, I definitely am not the font of all knowledge, around about neurodiverse conditions. I'm neurodiverse myself, so I have quite a lot of lived experience. My son is autistic ADHD. I have ADHD, dyspraxia, and dyscalculia. Thank you.
Declan, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks, Ryan. Afternoon, everybody. Ryan's given my name and given my title, so I'll give a little bit of background and welcome to Gillian, as well. I work with the University of Strathclyde. I'm not an academic. I guess I'm more a practitioner. I come very much from a commercial, world, whether it's leadership, whether it's learning, kind of the environs of HR, if you want to think of it that way. Very much like Barbara, there's some lived experience. I'm, particularly with my twin sister as well, and myself. So, I approach this from a multitude of people-centered, of course, but always thinking about, the education that I've gone through, which is law, psychology, and that sort of element. So I'm really excited to explore the space with you for the next 45 minutes. Thanks, Ryan.
Awesome. Hi, Gillian, I see you there. Thanks for joining us. Gillian's currently the head teacher at the Glasgow Gaelic Secondary School. Do you want to just take a wee minute or so just to introduce yourself, say hello, a little bit your background?
Sure, and apologies for the late join. I appreciate in a busy school and we're about to start SQ exams. So Fiske Mahila Junius, Mr. Gillian Campbell Thou. I'm Gillian Campbell Thou, the head teacher at Glasgow Gaelic School, which isn't the same as Gaelic, which is Irish. So Scottish Gaelic, we're the only Gaelic medium secondary in the world, which we're delighted to tell people. I have currently a school roll of 530, and one of the reasons I ended up getting involved in this is we were speaking about the the increase in neurodiversity that we see within our children now in schools, but also from a bilingual and a multilingual point of view. And this is something that's quite prevalent for us in our school, because quite often when it comes to neurodiversity, there can be late diagnosis for children who are working in 2 or 3 languages or whatever else. I'm going to join the club. I myself, I have ADHD. I call it a superpower, and the children think it's wonderful when you tell them. I was like, yeah, I've got it too. We talk about being a bit neurospicy, which they quite like, and we're very much of the opinion that we teach the child and not the label. So my job is to make it the most inclusive environment that I possibly can, in which children can reach their full potential. And that's about educating people, and that's about educating staff. That's about working with families as well. So it's wonderful. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for the opportunity. And apologies, I'm late and don't turn up to things right, but I'm here now. That's what we need.
Awesome. No, lovely to have you with us. Thank you, everyone. The first thing that we're going to look at, just as a bit of like scene setting generally, is what is neurodiversity? What are some of the typical traits, or what are there, emerging developments that we need to be aware of in the field? I'm going to pass over to Sam to lead us off, but if anyone wants to get involved and just talk, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so I guess maybe I might want to start by gently reframing the question, because it's totally understandable that we want to know what neurodiversity is, and what its traits are, but it's important to remember that we're not talking about a checklist necessarily. We're talking about people, and people aren't checklists. So it's a term that recognises that there's natural variation in the way human brains work. And it's a concept that came from the autistic community. It sort of says, instead of thinking in terms of disorders and deficits, we can recognise that people think, feel, process and interact with the world differently, and that difference is not a problem to fix. And I guess maybe that's why people are here and why we're chatting about it. So people who are neurodivergent might have diagnoses of autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, and many others. So there's patterns like sensory sensitivity, or differences in communication or social interactions, and challenges with executive functioning. But it's never really as simple as these are the list of the traits. So I guess if you've met one neurodivergent person, you've only met one neurodivergent person. So we don't need to pressurise ourselves to memorise a list of traits. It's perhaps better to ask the question to an individual, how can we create a culture where people don't have to mask, explain or prove their needs to feel like they belong?
Yeah, well, that makes sense. In terms of emerging developments, is there anything that we need to be aware of? Is there anything happening just now, or developments more generally that we should be paying particular attention to? Does anyone want to pick up on this maybe?
I suppose one of the, I don't know, the elephants in the room is certainly the narrative that's coming out of the United States. I think it's probably, for me, it's important that we, I don't know, nip that in the bud, fairly quickly. I think, there's a lot of false information and misinformation or half-truths there. So I think, I don't know, we're entering a phase where I guess I would advocate a bit of caution of where we're getting information from. And there's wonderful stuff out there in terms of Instagram and TikTok and all this sort of stuff there. But, you would expect somebody who works with a university to, advocate that let's look twice or three times, because, there's a lot of great narrative building on Sam's point about it being biodiversity, looking at it as neurodiversity and biodiversity, or, Fern Brady, the comedian, often talks about it like an operating system. So are we in a world designed for iPhones, but we're here using our Android or using our Google piece? So, there's an element of, you can approach it from a neutrality, or it's quite an emotive subject, and I think that is stirred up by as I said, by the narrative that's coming out of it. So I think that it's right that we kind of examine the source of that, and we have the conversation, and not looking at a label as somehow, I'm Irish, so I can understand Gillian's introduction of Scots Gaelic, and we handed the language over a few hundred years ago. But that doesn't define me, right? It's part of me, but it doesn't define me. So how do we have that as part of our identity? But for every person, they will have their own relationship of what neurodiversity means for them. So that's my 2 cents or 2 shekels, or worth that interested in the rest of the panel's view.
Can I pick up on what Declan said there as well about sort of social media? Definitely, everyone has a platform nowadays, and it's not necessarily vetted. And I always advise when I'm delivering the awareness sessions, please don't go on Facebook or TikTok and diagnose yourself, because basically what the information that gets put out there tends to be areas that impact everyone, a neurotypical person included. So you start to recognise things like, oh, I have issues with my short-term working memory. I'm not a particularly organised person. I really struggle to prioritise or concentrate. These are things that are going to happen over periods of time, depending what's going on in your life, what's going on in your workloads. You know, it's very important that we realise when you have a neurodiverse condition, this impacts you 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And that impact can look different for each person, depending on their background, the coping strategies that they have in place, the type of environments that they're in, and what kind of support mechanisms are present. So it's very important that we keep that in mind. And also, as I say, as I completely agree with Declan, think twice about what you're hearing. It's not always the truth. It's sometimes personal opinion.
If I could maybe move to speaking about the workplace specifically now, a lot of our audience are coming at it from the professional point of view. Talking from the point of view of being an employer in an organization, how can you identify that employees may be neurodiverse? Obviously, we've said it's everyone is different, but are there things that we can generally look for, things we can try and do to support that environment? I
would say that if an employer sort of recognises in an employee's sort of certain traits, and those traits might be things like kind of being very detail focused when they're on a task. It may be that there's a preference for routine and structure to be in place. There may be a sensitivity to certain external stimuli. But the employee themselves may not recognise that. And I would say have that sit-down conversation with the person, and ask them if, is there adjustments that we could put in place that could make this environment a better environment for you to work within, and potentially offering something like a workplace needs assessment where the individual would meet with an assessor, and the assessors are all fully qualified. They know what support's out there. They know the types of reasonable adjustments that will work for that person in that environment. And I think to take it on that positive step is to move towards that support mechanism. So even if someone doesn't recognise it in themselves, doesn't have that formal diagnosis, but they are potentially displaying some traits that are developing into challenges within the workplace, doesn't matter if that diagnosis is there or not, you want to support that employee. So, offering something like have that conversation with a workplace needs assessor can just provide that level of support that's needed at that time.
Ryan, if I can come in there,
Yeah.
I totally agree, Barbara. I think one of the things is probably even before you get to that idea of a needs-based assessment thing is having a culture where people feel that they can talk about it, and be, the whole thing about a workplace culture is hugely important, and that kind of comes from everybody, not just in the top, that comes from everybody, and it's so that it is recognised. And again, Barbara, what you're saying is what we do with children as well, is like, even if they don't have a piece of paper that says, they have a diagnosis, then we're already putting in place things. And some of the basic things we should be seeing in the workplace is, believe it or not, I'm so glad you can't see my desk, organised beautifully. It's because I'm creative, but that idea about how we create a language and communication friendly place, which means that whole declutter as well. And the declutter might come from, the kind of establishment where you work, but also in terms of the decluttering of communications, which we have found as being really, really big as well, and how we communicate with staff and making sure that it's accessible and open to everybody. Because as an employer, you have that responsibility where you do have to make sure that every reasonable adjustment is made. We have had cases ourselves with employees where we have worked with, we've had recommendations made to us from occupational health and also from outside agencies about how we make the workplace better and how that is reasonable and what it looks like. And sometimes that does involve difficult conversations as well, but they're important to be honest, because if we want to get the best out of our employees, and I say that both our employees and also the children that we look after, then you do have to create that, I suppose, atmosphere and ethos where people can be honest with each other, and also that you can address that. I suppose just as a wee aside, Again, our big thing is obviously for anyone that's bilingual, we will all be working with employees and working with people who speak more than one language. And that's a huge thing for it as well. And the cognitive load that's placed on them is massive when they're switching in and out of languages all the time. And even, I suppose, kind of practical things. One of the things that we did here is we actually changed the pattern of our working day and school day so that we actually made sessions shorter. And we took the load off a wee bit, and we had, and real predictability, so that people always know what's coming next and what's expected. And that's important in the classroom, but it's also really important in a workplace as well, in that organisation, so that, the meetings don't come out the blue, and so that, and also that the communication as well, particularly for people who, who will have processing, when you have to look at it. So I know, like, one of the reasons my ADHD was picked up was because of my speech patterns. Now I speak really quickly, and I'm actually trying very, very hard right now, believe it or not. I was sent to speech and language therapy to try and slow that whole speech down, but believe it or not, I speak quickly in all the languages that I speak, and that's how they picked it up. So I'm very aware of my communication, but I also have some members of staff who say, look, meetings, great, can we get it in writing as well? And that's really important as well in terms of making that kind of culture accessible, and people say, oh, is that not a workload issue? No, that's a communication issue, So that whole culture and ethos and environment, hugely important. And I'm just so glad you can't see the state of my desk. That would not be good.
I mean, if we're talking, about the culture and the environment, what are some of the, from your personal experiences, I can ask, to the panel, what are some of your experiences of initiatives that have been successful, that have been able to raise awareness of neurodiversity in an organization or support members of the organization, of the workforce, in terms of neurodiversity?
I'll kick us off if that's okay. I think it's really leading into what everybody said around, what's the theme here? It's about personalization, right, of work. So I guess if you look at any process, look, it's the beginning of an employee's life cycle is going to be the advertising of the role, right? So everything from that, trying to look at what language and terminology are we using, are we using vague terminology like go-getter or energetic or whatever, right? What does that actually mean, right? But then even thinking about the construct of, who is this process for? So if you think about an interview, right? You have 3 or 4 people around a table, or even virtually like this, eyeballing somebody. Like, is that an efficient process? Is that the best way? So for me, a lot of it is, irrespective of, a diverse population being 10, 15, 20% of your workforce, right? Just doing that hackathon of why do we do recruitment like this? Let's look at why can't they do a video, interview, for example? Why can't we give questions beforehand, being, I guess, I don't know, radical and asking ourselves these questions of what can we do, but asking who is the process for, and appreciating that there will be difficult conversations. We can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. But I've often found if the pandemic, etc., has taught us anything, there's probably more flexibility in our architecture and our frameworks than it's latent, it's dormant in there, right? So that's often the great thing about the neurodiverse is, I've heard it described as almost we are the canaries. So if we're experiencing discomfort, it's actually going to affect our neurotypical, whatever that is, colleagues, but maybe later down the line or further down the line. So I guess having that conversation or that thought process as an individual, because leadership's not just some CEO or chief people or head teacher or executive director or whatever. Like, it's much more distributed now. So what for you as a colleague is in your span of control, How can you be that ally and go, well, hang on a second, irrespective of whatever label Declan has, why are the processes like that? Like, and trying to have that, I don't know, empathy, tolerance, innovation type of piece for me. But I think particularly flipping the how do we recruit, how do we interview, because that'll then bleed into, and I mean that in a positive sense, into how we develop people, how we retain them, how we promote them, and God, for a second, I'm going to shut up in a second. God, I am not for a second sitting here going, universities have it cracked. I know for sure, right, we still do sit in an exam hall, but we are gradually moving into a more, well, show us as you go, continual assessment sort of piece. I would ask us all in a workplace to, how are we catching people doing the right thing rather than catching people doing the wrong? We're very good at catching people doing the wrong thing, but let's try and flip that. Ryan, that was the longest answer in the history of the world. I'll mute myself again now.
Not at all. Does anyone want
I
to add to
agree
that?
very much so with Declan. We need to celebrate the successes, you know, and carry out awareness sessions and create that culture of openness and inclusivity. And you can only do that when you talk about this on a daily basis, you know, and it becomes the norm. We're not asking employers to rewrite every policy and process to make it neuro-friendly. Just make it friendly and accessible for everyone. So it's just taking into account the different adjustments that might need to be made for anyone, and making sure that everything is accessible and equally fair, accessible for every person.
Yeah, I think it's about creating that safety to listen to your employees, listen to your leaders, what they're struggling with, to allow a two-way, or maybe it's more than two-way feedback, but it shouldn't just be we as leaders have sort of had this education and this is the way we're going to do it. You've got to listen to the feedback from your staff, haven't you?
Needs to be a collaborative process, right? Needs to be kind of everyone
Yeah.
moving together
it's-
rather than leaders dragging people.
It's okay to get it wrong and to hear
Yeah.
some feedback about that and say, okay, we can refine it.
As Declan said, it's, you know, we're all learning.
Yeah.
Neurodiversity it's a big thing, and it's going to become bigger because people are recognizing there's more information out there. People are recognizing and resonating with a lot of the information that's there. Sometimes it's their children going through the process of a diagnostic assessment and starting to resonate at that point, or having discussions with psychologists. You know, it's like we need to be open. Just exactly as Sam said, we need to be open, and make sure we can have conversations with people. Don't fear that that's going to have a negative impact, or there's going to be any judgment made, that people can have that open conversation, and it is a collaborative approach.
I think I would maybe add to that one. It's one thing to be aware of is not everybody wants to be identified, and they also don't want any type of adaptations or anything changed, and that's hugely important. It's just because they have a diagnosis doesn't mean that they want anything different, and that's about being equally respectful to that, and also recognizing that that may change. You know, I didn't want it then, but I think I now need it. You know, and those kind of important pastoral check-ins, I'll just check everything okay. It doesn't need to be, it might be formal. It's important to find out what do people need. But we've worked with both in terms of teachers and of staff, and also with children who are like, yeah, but I don't want anything different, and I don't want a badge, and I don't want a support group either. You know, and I think sometimes we can go too far the other way as well. Where, you know, you're throwing everything at them, I'm giving you all the support, and it actually becomes quite overwhelming. So it's a learning process, and I totally agree, Barbara, in terms of how we get that learning and the constant education, but it's also respecting other people's boundaries as they learn about themselves, and be ready to say that, you know, we have to be flexible with that and redirect and try and accommodate as best we can. And I think that's been something that we've seen, is where people say, yeah, I may have this diagnosis, but that doesn't mean I want anything different. And that's hugely important, because I think we've got to respect people's dignity, and that's massive, you know, and the idea, I like, you know, I totally agree with what everyone else saying. This is about just making it accessible and, you know, for everyone. And that, for us as employers, that's hard, because there are lots of different things that we have to meet, but guess what? That's our job. And if we want to get the best out of the people that we're working with, and I'm thinking about my own staff, I mean, one of the things that we talk about is, the menopausal women. So you've got to put all the thing in that the menopausal women need. Do you know, can you not get me a classroom nearer a toilet? No, but what I can get is a fan. I can get you water, you know, that kind of idea. But that's our job. That's what we're charged with, and that's what we get the salary at the end of the month for. But the dignity is massive, and quite often we forget about the dignity in it, and the dignity of the person as they are beginning to, you know, find out what works for them and what doesn't. And I know that I haven't been through that myself, you know, and just because you're neurodiverse doesn't mean that it's always going to be the same. Ask any menopausal woman who's going through it, and as things change and present differently. And I'm not making light of it, but I think these are the things that we need to be aware of. Dignity is massive in it, you know. So again, just because somebody's got a label doesn't mean they want a badge.
Quite true.
I love that.
Can I know Declan touched on recruitment a little bit there. Can I just come on specifically to recruitment, because I know our audience is something that's going to be there. There'll be an interest in it. if you're, trying to bring in neurodiverse employees, and we all kind of agree, this is a huge asset to organization, what can companies do, beyond what we've touched on already, to make hiring attractive to neurodiverse candidates or to make the hiring process more suitable for them?
I would say definitely look at inclusive language in the job adverts. Pretty much what Declan said, these, go-getters. What is a go-getter? Can I go for that job? So having that sort of inclusive language, but also within the adverts, highlighting your commitment to diversity and inclusion. If you're a disability confident employer, making sure your emblems are on there. Look at training your hiring managers, that we're not still stuck back in the day of the, yes, the chap had fantastic eye contact and a good strong handshake. It's about looking at people's skills, not their social interaction within that interview, and making sure the hiring managers know what they're looking for to get the best out of people.
Does anyone want to add anything there, Sam?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's some, I think Declan mentioned that there's some good materials available about inclusive language, and perhaps we can sort of send them out to people if they're interested in them. But perhaps it's also about just actually speaking to your employees that you know have ADHD or autism or dyslexia, and asking them to have a wee look at how job descriptions are laid out, what the format is, asking for some feedback, going back to people that have actually candidates that have applied for the role as well, to see how was that for you. Because sometimes actually just sitting and reflecting on it is really, really helpful for the experience of being employed or getting into the role.
I think I would agree with that, Sam. Sorry if I didn't mean to cut across you there. In terms of that language that's used both within recruitment and also at interviews, but there's also, I think, a place as well for a discussion round about what the job actually entails. Someone said to me, it's really not helpful when you say, "Oh, it would be great if you could do that." They said, because it's a bit like, well, it might be great, but do I actually have to do it? And I thought, oh my God, I need to and it's also about how, in terms of if the job that's being advertised or the job you're recruiting for, and there's no flexibility in that, you have to be really clear about that, because there are some jobs that may just not work. If people are unable to cope with change or whatever else, and it's about that honesty, and you don't have to, that's not about breaking bad news, that's just saying, I want to be clear about what the expectations are, and our language is a huge thing, it's a massive thing, to be able to say that this is what it is and this is what it isn't. So things like saying, oh, it'd be great if you could do that, or maybe you might want to think about, when the implication is you might want to think about it, I'd like you to do it. No, actually, that clear conversation is massive. The clarity of language is really, really something. And again, just going back to, again, when you're working with people who are multilingual, for example, there's a lot can be lost in translation. People who are not English who don't have English as a first language, and if your workplace is English speaking, is English as a first language, then you have to be conscious as well of the kind of cultural connotations and how you behave and what your language is like and your behaviours, from things like shaking hands, like physical space and touch and whatever else. And that can present quite differently for people who are neurodiverse, who come from different countries. So you also need to know those cultural things that are about being respectful. Okay, but that clarity of language is absolutely massive.
That's thank you for that. Declan, do you want to add something there?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Ryan. I mean, I guess I don't know if our 80 odd attendees are thinking, oh, I don't have the money. I don't know. I don't have the money to do anything, And for me, I would often encourage, the creation of something. For example, I'm going to throw something out very ambitious here now, right? So I have heard people talk about the virtue of, virtual reality, for example, because I guess I want us to think about what is a gentle wave to one person is a seawall to another person. So, there's a poverty of aspiration. Sometimes I couldn't even possibly go for this job, right? But if you're sitting here and you have a portfolio and you're thinking, oh, I don't have the time or I don't have the money, often when you do this virtual reality, you do these other things, they can be reused over and over again. over and over again. So even something as simple as, and I guess this will vary depending upon the size of the organization that you're from, right? But if you don't have the scale to have a network or have a group, perhaps your industry body does, right? So there may be a way. We talked a lot about collaboration and a lot of partnership here, but I think trying to make it as real as possible, okay? So saying, show me what you would do. Give me, I know we talk about competency-based interviews, and that's tell me about a time when. I guess it's trying to, again, have that personalization of, here's what the office looks like. Here's we have a network. Here's here's a piece of work that we actually want you to demonstrate to us. What would your decision criteria? What would your approach be? I would encourage again everybody in your organization to think about, that kind of that, I don't know what the right terminology is, that heroic significance of small action, right? Just what are the little things that you can do? So you might be thinking, oh, great, that Irish guy talked about virtual reality. I'm not Iron Man. I don't have all this war chest, but I guarantee you there are 5, 10 little things that could make the world of difference to people. And that's what I would encourage people to do. Look at what the CIPD are doing. Look at what universities are doing. Institute of Director, there's not a shortage. Of course, be skeptical and look and see how it fits into your particular sphere. But what we're seeing, is, I'm going to use a fancy word, is that zeitgeist of, there's a lot of discussion about neurodiversity and autism and other conditions right now. So you're therefore seeing a sharing of a lot of positive resources. How do you make them real and meaningful for your sector, for your organization, for your office? I guess that's what I would invite and challenge people to do.
It's a really, really strong message, Declan. Thank you for that. And thank you to everyone for your insights so far. There has been quite a few questions have come in while we've been talking through this. So I'm aware we've got just over 10 minutes left. I'm going to try and pick out as many as we can that we can tackle in the time we have remaining. The first one we have is how can employers help with neurodiversity in terms of language/strategies? I think Declan, you're probably well placed to answer that for us.
Yeah, a bit slow there on the unmute. Sorry about that. I think
Okay.
for me, I think it's trying to be people centered. So, for example, saying autistic person rather than person with autism, for example, saying, is autistic rather than has autism or suffers from autism, that kind of, and also just, trying to avoid, everyone's on the spectrum somewhere, right? These kind of things, so it's trying to think about being people centered. It's trying to think, how can I be affirmative? How can I be inclusive? How can I be supportive? And there's not a one hard and fast rule. So sometimes it's asking the individual, what is your preference? That would be my encouragement. And I guess that's the language piece of it. And I'm interested in my fellow panelists' views. And in terms of the strategy, it's probably having that open, fluidic, movable. So we live in a volatile, uncertain, changeable, and ambiguous world. I think that's VUCA. That's what the abbreviation stands for. So equally, our strategy needs to be exactly that. We need to be changeable. We need to be looking at the nuance for our sector, for our geography, for our demographics. So, each year looking at our corporate strategy, and not just from a, it's a good thing to do, corporate social responsibility. But for me, it's that we are, as organizations, there is a risk that we're being wasteful, we're wasting out, we're missing out. And people keep hearing the narrative, regardless of what sector or organization, do more with less, right? You have talent in your organization that are, I guarantee you, are neurodiverse. And we're probably missing out an opportunity. I'm not trying to make it performative, okay? It's not just about what we can squeeze out of people, but I'm saying there are people in your organization, and there's an opportunity there for us to engage with them in a different way. Those would be my thoughts. I'm trying to keep it brief around because I'm a bit wordy, so interested in everybody else's view.
I would say that we need to look at challenging unconscious bias. Unconscious bias is human nature. It's, we're presented with a situation, we go through our own experiences and thoughts on that and pull on that to help us make a decision to be able to move forward. But we've got to be very, very careful that we're not making assumptions about someone's abilities or struggles that they may have. And again, leaning on that, well, I met someone who was autistic before and they couldn't do that. Therefore, this person here won't be able to do that either. You know, that understanding that the impact of these conditions is very different for each individual person. And as Declan says, very much person-centred, collaborative approaches. Use your neurodiverse staff to help inform you on the best ways to take things forward. You know, everybody wants to feel heard and seen and valued. And that builds loyalty in employees. That increases retention for employers. You know, these are all benefits. You know, and if someone's out there and they're experiencing the world differently, processing information differently, it's a huge advantage for an organisation. They can increase productivity, they can increase efficiency, but we need to be able to remove the barriers to allow that person to be able to do that.
Does anyone want to add anything to that one, or shall we move on? The other question that's coming here is, what advice do you have for someone who is neurodivergent in sharing their experience at work with their colleagues? Does someone want to jump in on that one?
I guess it's maybe about, it's up to them, really, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a personal decision. So some people, I guess, like today, I didn't introduce myself as having a lived experience, but everybody else has spoken about that, and it's your choice, you know, and it's about not having to feel that pressure or obligation to stand up and say this is what I am, or this is what my challenges are. If they do want to share, it can help to think about, like, why is that? Is it to ask for support, or do they just want to help you understand them better, or is it to connect with people? You know, what's their kind of rationale for it? And it would be also okay for a person to sort of say that they don't have to say I am this or I have this. You know, it's their choice. It might just be, listen, I need a bit of quiet time to be able to focus, so I'm putting my headphones on, or I'm going to go and sit in this quiet space, or I need a bit of time out after I've completed this big task. And thanks very much for, you know, your patience with that. And I think for leaders, then perhaps it's just about continuing to support that culture, that it's safe to speak up or to choose not to speak up, that you don't have to be like waving a big flag, but actually it's okay if you want to wave a big flag too.
Yeah, Sam, I was going to say the same. I totally agree with you. I think we have a lot of people who we work with who it's part of their identity, and they'll want to tell you. Oh, by the way, I didn't tell people for a long time, and I'm still fairly kind of it's not something. Oh, hi, I'm Gillian, and well, I'd probably say, hi, I'm Gillian, I'm fat, I'd like to be at least 3 stone, you know, lighter. But it's that idea of how you identify yourself, and I think some people will identify fairly early because they're also looking for people who might be similar, or who are going through that same journey, and they're looking for their tribe. And I think that's really important. But similarly as well, it's about that culture, isn't it? You know, and it's about when you're ready, and the idea that you can be able to say, I just need a wee bit of space just now, or whatever. And sometimes, you know, I'll say to people, but you'll appreciate just now that I've got 20 tabs open in my head and there's a lot going on. So if you just, and it's a bit like having a conversation with me, just give me 5 minutes. And I'll come back to you. And I think being able to preface it like that, it's hugely important. But you should never hide who you are. You know, it's not anything to be ashamed of. And it's important that you're able to be yourself, because if you then start masking at work, then that's just going to create problems as you go along, both at work and in your personal life. And it's bloody exhausting, you know. So I think you just have to get to that point where you feel comfortable enough in how you identify.
Yeah, and I guess, you know, I think we've mentioned this before, it can change too, you know, at some point you might want to identify or ask for more strategies to be put in place to make adjustments or less, just to make it really equitable for people. So it might change for people depending on what's going on for them in their personal lives or in their workplace.
We've got a question coming just now from Tracy, who says, outside of communication, what can be done to support existing employees?
Do you mean outside of like ways of communicating? Is
I,
that
I think so, yeah. Just, I mean, we've spoken a lot about communication, but I mean, maybe in terms
Yes.
of practical stuff, Barbara, do you want to
Yeah.
speak maybe more about
Yes.
what can be done?
When I carry out a workplace needs assessment, as I say, I'll take background information from the person, so I'll look at the job role they carry out, any challenges that presents, and that allows me to look at reasonable adjustments that can be implemented. So reasonable adjustments can vary. It may be using something like assistive technology. So it might be something like speech to text software or text to speech software. It might be like recording devices. It may be using things like AI, like Copilot, to summarize information, take minutes of meetings. There's various different things out there. And we would also recommend things like coaching strategy training, where the person works one-on-one with the coach, and the coach will look at what strategies have you got in place just now. Because remember, a lot of this is depending on the background of the person. Some of the strategies may not be strong strategies, they may not be healthy strategies. And they can work one-on-one with the coach to look at what's going to work best for that person. That coach will help them to implement new supportive strategy, basically give the person the tools to support themselves in that particular environment. But we can also make recommendations for adjustments within the workplace. It might be additional time to carry out specific tasks. It may be adjustments made for meetings or training events, attending those remotely if there's going to be a lot of anxiety, it's premises I don't know, it's going to be a large filled space, it's going to be overstimulating for me. Potentially the travel could be an issue, or I need the agenda in advance, or I need follow-up notes after the meeting. There's different adjustments that can be put in place, like free of charge, that organisations can implement immediately, that are just, they're so tiny. It's pretty much what Declan said. They're so tiny adjustments, but they would mean the world to the person and the difference that it would make to that person. I hope that answers that.
I'm aware we've only got a couple of minutes left. This is a really interesting one, I think, though, that's been asked. It says, what if I suspect an employee may be neurodiverse, but they do not recognize this in themselves? I mean, that's a really interesting one. I don't know, Barbara, you mentioned something similar to that earlier.
Yeah. This comes up often. I deliver a lot of management training, where you're basically supporting the managers who are working and supporting their employees who are neurodiverse. And often they will recognise very strong traits in an individual who's perhaps from a neurodiverse family, and the person doesn't recognise it in themselves. And again, it's just about having that conversation. If the person's presenting with some areas of difficulty within the working environment, having that conversation round about, maybe there's adjustments we could put in place for you that would be supportive and help you in that particular situation. And as I say, I would always recommend a workplace needs assessment. You get the workplace needs assessment done, it will make those recommendations. And that it's going to work for that person in the environment that they're in. But it's actually a very common question. If you can't have that conversation or that can't move forward, there's really not much you can do. You can only do what you can do. If the person's not happy to discuss it or disclose it, then there's no support that you could offer that person. But it's, again, pretty much what Gillian was saying and Sam said, and Declan, creating that psychologically safe environment that people can have those conversations. Hopefully we bring that out.
Yeah, I was wondering about, just being able to say, that actually your strengths are really based within such and such an area. And I can see this is more challenging, but how could we support that? Maybe that's a good way to start the conversation. You're right, it depends on what the other person brings back to you. It might be a conversation that won't necessarily go anywhere, but it's about being that line manager that's able to say, I'd love for you to feel confident in this area. And I can see your lack of confidence. What can I do to help? Would it help if I did the task with you? Or, Susie's really good at that. Would you like to work with Susie on that? Thinking a little bit more creatively, perhaps.
Yeah, definitely.
I think that's it's a good message to end on, Sam. Thank you. That's about our time up for this afternoon. I just want to say thanks to the panel members for joining us. Thanks to our audience, of course, for joining us. We do hope it's been useful. You found some key aspects you can take away to your own organizations. Please do check us out online at lifelinkworkwell.org.uk and follow us on LinkedIn. If you're interested in getting in touch with us for whatever reason, even if it's just answer some more questions we didn't maybe cover off here, then the website, LinkedIn, that's ideal. Some members of our team will get in touch with you. They'll do a little follow-up and we'll send you a recording of the session once we get that all put together. Just going to say, hopefully you have a lovely rest of your day. And thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.